Okay, good morning, my dear students. This is Amit Bhattacharya, your teacher, welcoming you to one of our online sessions. Today we are going to deal with Sri Lankan literature. Sri Lankan literature written in English, to be precise. Now, why are we actually discussing Sri Lankan literature in English? We are discussing Sri Lankan literature in English because we have certain poems by Yasmin Gunaratne on our syllabus, on our PG syllabus, and that's why we are dealing with Sri Lankan literature in English. Now, at the outset, let me express a debt of gratitude to a few persons without whom this class wouldn't have been possible. In fact, my interest in Sri Lankan literature was started in a curious way by two persons whom I have never met, but whose writings I have read. One was Anand K. Kumaraswamy, because we had to study intentional fallacy by Wimsatt and Beardsley, and this was basically a rejoinder to Anand K. Kumaraswamy. So in those days, there was no internet to speak of in our remote area, and we had to search a lot. And ultimately we found out, thanks to David Lodge, that Anand K. Kumaraswamy was a Sri Lankan. Okay. Then we also studied a pioneering book by K.R.S. Srinivasa Iyengar, Indian Writing in English, where talking about the nomenclature, Indian writing in English, Indo-Anglian literature and all that, K.R. Srinivasa Iyengar was talking about Ceylon, he was talking about Colombo, he was talking about Sri Lankan literature in the passing, before he actually delved deep into the realm of Indian literature in English. Now, these two persons created an interest in me for Sri Lankan literature. Then two other persons. There was D.C.R.A. Gunatilake, whose book I have read on Sri Lankan literature in English. Please, those of you who are interested may read this book. It's a very good book. Then, fortunately, I came in contact with one of the most important Sri Lankan novelists who is writing in English, who also writes in Sinhala. I'm talking about Daya Dishanayake. I met him during a seminar, and when I heard about his writings, I felt interested in reading them. And when I read, I thought I should read more. Then obviously Yasmin Gunaratne, because I have done my research on Kamala Das, sharp women poets like Razia Khan, like Yasmin Gunaratne, Nadia Anjuman, Maki Qureshi, these names also came to my ear, and I read some of their poems. It's very difficult to get their poems here for love nor money, but I managed to get some of them and read. Okay. Now, in the 1980s, when some of our Indian Bengali sports journalists actually went to cover the soccer World Cup, when they said that they had come from Kolkata, they were given a perfunctory nod and a casual reference to Mother Teresa was what they got from their foreign colleagues and foreign players. Similarly, when we think about Sri Lankan literature, certain names come to our mind. Sam Silvadurai is there, Michael Ondache is there, Yasmin Gunaratne is there, Colin De Silva is there. The Dishanayaki is there. Yes, we have heard about them. We have read some of their poems and play and fiction and all that. But when I was given the assignment to read with you the poems of Yasmin Gunaratne, I started reading in real earnest. And I saw that it was quite an overwhelming experience. You know, it was a really check of how little we knew. Now, first thing that we need to do is, while talking about Sri Lankan literature is in English, I have to be very candid and tell you that it doesn't claim to be a comprehensive introduction to Sri Lankan literature in English, because such an introduction is impossible in 1 or 2 lectures. So my introduction to Sri Lankan literature that I am going to give you will be number 1, personal, and number 2, partial. Because I have at the outset decided that only giving you information about certain writers and their texts will not do. Because you can find them out in today's world of internet and Google, the great. You can very easily find them out. So what I am going to do is to give you some kind of an idea about the drift of the whole thing. So let us go to the second slide of our presentation today. I am going to talk about Sri Lanka. Now, Sri Lanka, if you look at the maps, you know, there is a map of Sri Lanka and there is also a map of India. Now, Sri Lanka is an island nation situated in the Indian Ocean. It is towards the south of the Indian subcontinent. To be precise, it is to the southwest of the Bay of Bengal and southeast of the Arabian Sea. And it is divided from the Indian subcontinent by the Gulf of Mannar and the Pok Straits. Sri Lanka is an ancient land, and Sri Lankans are an ancient people. You know, archaeologists have found out archaeological remains of very ancient day in Sri Lanka. So, Sri Lankan civilization is also very, very ancient. You know, look at Sri Lanka as an island nation. Obviously, and that too, a neighbor of a giant of a country, a subcontinent, that is India. So, Sri Lanka actually poses a brilliant case of at once difference and dependence. Different from India, but dependent on India, influenced by India, because people from India have often tried to invade certain portions of Sri Lanka, from Bengal, from Kalinga, from the Chola dynasties and all that. From many South Indian dynasties, actually from kingdoms, they had mounted expeditions against Sri Lanka. Similarly, Sri Lanka has been visited with no friendly intention by people from Burma, from the Malay Peninsula, from China, from time to time. Closer to our day, Sri Lanka has been visited and partially colonized by many. For example, the Portuguese, the Dutch, and last but not least, the English. If you look at the Sri Lankan population, you will see that more than 2 crore of population. There are the Sinhala majority. There are the Sri Lankan Tamils, Indian Tamils, Sri Lankan Moors, the Vedas, the Chinese, the Malays, the Burghers. You know, Burghers, this race was created out of the miscegenation and the intermarriage between the Dutch colonial masters and the indigenous people of Sri Lanka. So all these things have been there. Sri Lanka was greatly influenced by Buddhism. We all know about Mahendra and Sanghamitra. Arguably, the first Buddhist message was brought to Sri Lanka by them. And a sizable portion of the Sri Lankan population was converted, they converted to Buddhism. And there were the Hindus, the Tamils were Hindus. There are Muslims, there are Christians, and others as well. So Sri Lanka, the main languages are Sinhala, Tamil, and obviously English. So when you look at Sri Lanka, you are looking at a multi-ethnic, multilingual country. You know, so far as the literacy rate is concerned, Sri Lanka has over 90% literacy rate. So it is the highest in the SAARC region, and also Sri Lankans are one of the highest in Asia, 93%, according to the data available in 2018. And you know, Sri Lankan people, culturally very advanced, with very developed literary sense because of the high literacy rate, because of the oral tradition, because of the Buddhist influence. So it was a ripe place. It was a very, very fit place for literary approaches. Okay. So let us move to the next slide, please. We are going to talk about Sri Lankan literature. We all know that we are going to talk about Sri Lankan literature in English. We have to understand that Sri Lankan literature is not all about Sri Lankan literature in English. There is a very rich and very voluminous literary canon from the vernacular languages, you know, those languages that are spoken, Sinhala, Tamil, and so on. And Sri Lankan literature in English, we have to understand, is basically a child of the English, that is the medium of expression, and the sensibility, that is Sri Lankan. That is very, very eclectic, embracing as it does diverse influences and diverse elements. You see, from the figures, from the data that we receive of the Sri Lankan National Book Fair held every year in Colombo, from the data about the small-scale publishing houses that have sprouted at an enormous rate in the last, say, 15 to 20 years, we can very easily understand that the book market is alive and kicking over there. Literature is not dead. It is very much alive. So, We have to understand these factors if we really want to understand Sri Lankan literature. So we have discussed how many slides? Nirupam? See, in the fourth slide, what is there? Let's go to the next slide. Yes, the problematics of nomenclature. Yes. When we talk about Sri Lankan literature in English, we have to understand this is the erstwhile colonizers' speech that has been adopted by the Sri Lankan writers writing in English. So just as people like Kamala Das have faced problems in India regarding the allegedly parasitic nature of Indian writing in English. So Sri Lankan writers in English have also faced that. Now, how to categorize Sri Lankan literature in English? That has also been debated by the critics almost unceasingly. What to call it? Is it Commonwealth literature, part of Commonwealth literature, post-colonial literature, new literatures in English, or Anglophone literature? What is it? Now, Commonwealth, we talk about Commonwealth as a politico-cultural framework created by the erstwhile colonial masters, the British, in order to keep some kind of a cultural control over the erstwhile colonies. Even though apparently it seems Commonwealth is all about a shared well-being and prosperity, Commonwealth literature actually links literatures produced in certain countries and regions that have been dominated by the British. Okay. Then it is also called post-colonial literature, because of the fact that Sri Lanka was at one time a colony. So obviously, the encounter between the colonizer's ideology and the colonized subjectivity had really been there, and that has to be interrogated. The point of intersection has to be interrogated. Similarly, an agency has to be created for the dispossessed and the underprivileged. The voiceless has to be given voice. The silent subaltern should be allowed to speak, and even almost forced to speak. Then it is also called a part of the new literatures in English, but there are certain objections that have been raised from time to time. How new? Sri Lanka has received the European education through English in the 19th century itself. So today in the 21st century, is it still new? Now, sometimes we say that Anglophone literature, because the language question is paramount in any project of categorization, we may also call it Anglophone literature. So let's drop it for the time being. But this is very significant because much of the ideological baggage associated in the creation and consumption of Sri Lankan literature in English has been due to how we look at it, the canon. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. What is? Yes. Now, Braj Kachru has come up with, he was a linguist, he was a professor of linguistics in Illinois University, and he had come up with the idea of world English. And he talked about the idea, the model of three concentric circles. Look at your screens, there are three circles, concentric circles. So the innermost circle is called the inner circle. That was the base of English language and literature. For example, the United Kingdom, the United States of America, the Anglophone Canada, some parts of where the West Indies, Australia and New Zealand, and so on. So beyond that, there is an outer circle. And we are today concerned chiefly with the outer circle. Because India, Sri Lanka, Nigeria, South Africa, and so on and so forth, they actually belong to the outer circle, where English, though not the mother tongue, is a very important official language that is used in the institutions. Then obviously there is at the outer edge of this model, there is the outermost circle is called the expanding circle. Why? Because English is now a world language. Because English is used in other parts of the world, for example, Russia, China, Japan, Korea, and so on, as a language of international diplomacy and commerce and trade and all that. So that actually constitutes the expanding circle. So when we talk about the Sri Lankan context, Sri Lanka belongs to the outer circle. Why is it important in any discussion of Sri Lankan literature in English? It is important because in Sri Lanka, English is not the mother tongue, but one of the chief languages, one of the official languages that is used in institutions. So obviously the hint is towards a bilingual at least, and also by extension a multilingual language. That is important. That is important because the coexistence of various languages, Sinhala and Tamil on the one hand and English on the other, with the cultural, linguistic, literary and political baggage thereof, cannot be ignored. That is why this outer circle, this reality is very, very important in any discussion of Sri Lankan literature. Are we ready to go to the next slide, please? Yes, what is there? We all know that Sri Lanka was a part of the British Empire. We all know that as an erstwhile colony, its encounter with the English language and English literature was not willing. It was not voluntary. It was forced upon Sri Lanka to a large extent. We all know about it. In the 1830s, from the 1830s onwards, we always talk about India. Sri Lanka also followed suit. Sri Lanka was given, along with the British political system, the British rule, for the Sri Lankan civil service, willing employees, civil servants had to be made out of the local population because all of them could not be imported from England. It was too expensive. It was preposterous. So men had to be taught English language. Men had to be taught English literature. Men had to be taught English culture and the ways of looking at things, the outlook on life. Why? Because if we think about Althusser's idea of the ideological state apparatus, English language, English literature, English culture was something that had to be inculcated in order to ensure a willing submission by the Sri Lankans, at that time called the Ceylon, and they were the Ceylonese. So they had to be made submissive. They had to be conquered ideologically as well as, not only physically, not only repressively. So that is why this was very, very important. Okay. Okay. Now, when we talk about English literature, when we talk about Sri Lankan literature in English, you see, we are talking about two different literatures, but two interrelated literatures. When we talk about Sri Lankan writing, when we talk about Sri Lankan literature in English, are we only talking about literature produced by Sri Lankans in English, or are we also going to talk about literature in English produced in Sri Lanka, not necessarily by Sri Lankans? When we talk about the important the books that were produced in Sri Lanka, we talk about the Forest Life of Ceylon, by William Knighton, yes, in 1854, or the names are difficult. Okay, we can also talk about The Village in the Jungle by Leonard Woolf, produced in 1913. We can talk about the writings of a poet like Reverend Senior, who was an English scholar and poet and a clergyman, a vice principal of Trinity College, Kandy, who was called the Bard of Lanka. He was born in the 1870s and died in 1938, long before Sri Lanka received the Dominion status in 1948, or longer before Sri Lanka received her independence in 1972. So, we are not only talking about literature produced by the elite, by the English educated upper class or upper middle class urban dwellers in Sri Lanka. We are also going to talk about literature produced by the foreigners who resided in Sri Lanka. Because today, even when we talk about Sri Lanka, aren't we reminded of people like Tony Greig, the Australian cricketer who lived the last years of his life in Sri Lanka predominantly? Or think about Sir Arthur C. Clarke, the famous British writer, the writer of 2001 Space Odyssey, or 3001 The Final Odyssey, and all that. We are reminded of that. When we talk about Indian literature, when we talk about Indian culture, are we not reminded of people like Dalrymple or Michel Denino? Yeah, we are. So, you see, the problem is, when we talk about Sri Lankan literature in English, we have to understand that the English language was got from outside. English language was adopted by Sri Lankans, and they wrote in English. First of all, the phase that we are reminded of is the adopt phase. When they actually learned English, tried to mimic English literary and linguistic conventions. Then came the adapt phase, to invoke the authority of someone like Peter Barry, we may say that then came the adapt phase in which the Sri Lankan writers wanted to be proficient in English, write like the Englishmen. It was a kind of a challenge that they wanted to take up, that took up the conflict. And then came the last phase, that is very important. When we speak in Bengali or Hindi, whatever is our mother tongue, if it is Hindi or Bengali, are we always aware of grammar? Are we always talk about very, very literary language or talk in very literary language? No. We use it, we abuse it, we misuse it. It's our own sweet will. Whatever we want to do, we can do it. Why? Because English, even though it is not our mother tongue, the language I speak becomes mine. Its distortions, its squarenesses, all mine, mine alone. It is funny perhaps, but it is honest. Don't you see? That was what Kamala Das said in an introduction. So that is the adapt phase. And if you really want to read Sri Lankan literature in English, you have to understand this ultimate goal that Sri Lankan literatures generation after generation had striven for. It was not enough to tuck in certain words or expressions of Sinhala or Tamil into English. No, it had to come naturally. And no forced element had to be there. It had to be naturalized. So that was the goal. But this goal is not reached in one day. And that is what we are going to talk about in our the rest of our discussion. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay. English was the colonizers' language. We all know, historians, political scientists often say that Sri Lanka received her independence at least partially because of the way India was fighting for her independence. I have my doubts, but that is one of the views entertained by many historians. Now, whatever it may be, at least there was an emergence of nationalistic spirit or fervor in Sri Lanka also. Now, no two places can react to one situation the same way. We can't expect it. We can't expect India and Sri Lanka or Bangladesh and Afghanistan to react to the same situation of foreign rule in the same way. But at least there is one common denominator. What is that? That is the nationalist spirit and fervor, the spirit of patriotism. So whereas even after independence, some Sri Lankan writers wanted to take up English as their creative medium, linguistic medium, as a natural choice. There were others who cried foul. There was a severe nationalist backlash against the idea of English as being the natural choice. Understood? For example, if we think about Hell, writing in the 1960s, he was a Sri Lankan poet, you know. He was talking about the prognosis was one of doom and gloom, you know. He was talking about the very little time left for English in Sri Lankan context, in the Sri Lankan context, as a viable literary medium. But my dear friends, Sri Lankan literature in English has not only survived, but also thrived. It still thrives. And we can very easily understand this if we read the writings of Sri Lankans, those who are living in Sri Lanka, those who have migrated elsewhere. People like the Adishanayake and people like Sam Salvatore or Michael Ondaatje. There have been those who have migrated. There have been those who have come from outside, like Anne Ranasinghe, a German who was married to a Sri Lankan physician. There have been those also who have for one time lived abroad and then have come back. People like Yasmin Gunarat, for example. So in any understanding of Sri Lankan literature in English, we have to understand this as well. There has been an element of resilience and renewal that have placed Sri Lankan literature in English on very firm footing. This is something we have to understand. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Okay, so when we talk about Sri Lankan literature in English, we have to talk about the influences also. We all know that Sri Lanka has been influenced by Buddhism to a large extent. The influence have been manifold, you know, religious, political, cultural, and literary, obviously historical, all told. How? You know, we all know that the Buddhist religious canon is very rich. The stories from the life of Tathagata, the Jataka tales of the earlier incarnations of Siddhartha Gautama, these have, along with the philosophical, religious, and even occult literature produced by the Buddhist philosophers, by the Buddhist monks and tantrics. They have not only been voluminous, they have also cast a very significant influence on Sri Lankan literature in general and Sri Lankan literature in English in particular. We have already discussed the role played by bilingualism and multilingualism. It is not only about the insertion of stray words or phrases or customs. It is also about an amalgamation of dissimilar sensibilities. The oral tradition is very significant as well. We all know that in earlier centuries, religious literature was kept alive and transmitted from generation to generation by the word of mouth. And that is why a council of Theravada Buddhism was held in Pura. Why? Because ultimately an emergency caused this. There was an epidemic. Many of the reciters whose duty it was to keep alive the literary and religious literature and tradition alive, they had died. And that's why it was felt that the ancient wisdom had to be preserved in the form of manuscripts. So palm leaf manuscripts were used, and they were not only kept in various Buddhist monasteries in Sri Lanka, but they were also taken to the other foreign lands, like Laos, like Cambodia, and other places as well. We all know that the interaction, the linguistic, religious, educational interaction between Nalanda in India and Sri Lankan Buddhism was very, very intimate. It is often said that after the Nalanda was sacked by the invaders, Bhattacharya Khilji, much of the Buddhist literary canon was transferred to Sri Lanka. So obviously, these influences have to be taken into consideration in any understanding of Sri Lankan literature. Okay, let's go to the next slide, please. Now, what can be the themes of a particular literature, a national literature? We all know what Hippolyte Taine had told us. The literature is the product of the race, the milieu, and the moment. Just as the literature is, the writer is, the race, the milieu, and the moment. So obviously the themes at least to a large extent will be common. What are the themes? Let's read out and explain one by one. Yes, Lindu. Yes. Now we are talking about changing circumstances. How Sri Lanka was changing from the 19th century onwards. After the pre-colonial period, during the colonization, after independence, because of nationalistic fervor, because of inter-ethnic tensions, because of the very many insurrections, rebellions, uprisings, and disturbances that took place from time to time because of the civil war between the Sinhala majority and the Hindu Tamil minority, the government and the LTTE in the 70s and 80s and afterwards as well, till the defeat of the LTTE in say 2009. So all these things have meant that often Sri Lankan literature, which is at the bottom the reflection of life, has represented both the fact of alienation, be it social alienation or self-alienation of the individuals, of the groups, and identity, its quest and its expression. Both of it. Quest for identity. Who am I? What does it mean to be a Sri Lankan? What does it mean to be a Sinhala? What does it mean to be a Sri Lankan Tamil? What does it mean to be a Bargar or a Sri Lankan Moor? We are often reminded of the trousered Harijan or the Chandala woman. We also think about the eavesdropper of the Adishanayake. So, alienation is something that has given one of the most important thematic drives to Sri Lankan literatures who have written in English. Just as it does to any writer writing anywhere in any language the world over. Okay, next point, alienation, self and society. Yes, thanks to Buddhism, thanks to Hinduism, the majority as well as the minority, and both, they have been incited or inspired to think about philosophical and metaphysical issues. And you will see that Sri Lankan literature has got a very, very serious aspect of it. Ruminations about the self and the society. How does the self find itself accommodated or rendered an outcast? How does society operate? There are many points of division. Rural, urban, Sinhala, Tamil, upper class, lower class. We all know that in the 1970s onwards, Sri Lanka had liberated its economy. It was one of the first countries, at least of the South Asian region, to throw open its economy, liberate its economy. So there was a great deal of division, discrepancy in wealth distribution. The gap between the rich and the poor, the haves and the have-nots, was quite enormous in some cases. So all these things have been dealt with by the writers of Sri Lanka. Okay, next, self and society then. Yes, migration and metamorphosis. Yes, in the case of Sri Lanka, just as in the case of India, migration is something that is not only outward bound, that is also inward bound. Because Sri Lanka, just like India, has been a place of a mixed population. দিবে আর নিবে মিলাবে মিলিবে যাবে না ফিরে এই ভারতের মহামানবের সাগর তীরে. The way Rabindranath was talking about the waves of invaders, that have come to India, that have settled down here and enriched Indian polity, Indian culture, Indian human stock. That almost holds similarly true with the Sri Lankan condition. We all know, I have while discussing Sri Lanka, its past, its present, and to some extent its future as well. We all know that Sri Lankan population, Sri Lankan culture have embraced people from outside. And these people from outside have not only taken enormous riches out of Sri Lanka. It is said that King Solomon had taken pearls, peacock feathers, sandalwood, and other things from Tarshish, a port in Sri Lanka, But they have also contributed to a great deal, to a great extent, to the enrichment of Sri Lankan language, literature, culture, economy, and so on and so forth. Similarly, Sri Lankans have from time to time, for various reasons, in search of greener pastures, in order to flee from persecution, for all sorts of conceivable reasons, they have gone to foreign lands and settled down there. And that's why there is a rich and vibrant Sri Lankan diaspora in many places. In the United Kingdom, in Canada, in Australia, in the Netherlands, in Fiji, and all those other places. And that has led to metamorphosis. It is not only the fact that Sri Lankan literature has readily borrowed from texts and authors from outside. It is also that the human material that has produced the Sri Lankan literary and linguistic and cultural landscape that have been also eclectic. We all know that. Okay. And next, the next point. Yes, nature. We all know that Sri Lanka has got a tropical vegetation. It has got rich flora and fauna, but at the same time, nature has enough for meeting the human need. Nature can never have enough to satisfy the human greed. So progress has often denuded nature. Progress has often destroyed environment. And nature has often taken very severe revenge. So the relationship between nature and man has been something very close to the heart of the average Sri Lankan writer and Sri Lankan reader. Writer in English and reader of writings in English. The national spirit. You think about the United States in the mid-19th century. You think about the civil war of that place. You think about the tussle between the East and the West Pakistan. That also led to consolidation and separatism. On the one hand, there has been a lot of work produced promoting the unified Sri Lankan language. There have also been separatist literature produced by both communities, Sinhala as well as Tamil. And the fact of diasporic experience, migration, transnationalism, dislocation, displacement, settlement, ubiquity, the here and now, all these things have given ample grist for the literary meal of the Sri Lankan writer. I hope we can now go to the next slide, please. We all know genres are very easy to understand. There is prose that includes both fiction and non-fiction, novel and short story, and we all know. And I don't think we should be bothered too much with giving names. We all know about the dice of the gods. We all know about the Chandala. Just as we all know about Colin De Silva's blockbuster series, Sinhala series. We all know about it. We all know about the Dishanayaka's writings. But we are not here talking about Sri Lankan novel, because we are going to talk about Sri Lankan poetry, especially. Let us skip this and keep this for future discussion. I would love to talk about Sri Lankan novel because I have found it very fascinating to discuss. Similarly, so far as Sri Lankan drama is concerned, we all know that one of the most important export items that the United Kingdom had was Shakespeare. So often, drama produced in Sri Lanka and enacted by the locals. In many cases, they were English plays, drawing room comedies, comedies of manners, Shakespearean plays. They were written and performed. We all know about Gunashekara, we all know about Dias, we all know about others, But compared to Sri Lankan poetry in English and even Sri Lankan novel, Sri Lankan drama has left behind to some extent. And I am really eager to skip these things and go to Sri Lankan poetry now. So, Sri Lankan poetry, so far as Sri Lankan poetry is concerned, it is the product of the union between the indigenous tradition and the foreign tradition. The foreign tradition here does not only mean the Western tradition, because Sri Lankan poetry has also been influenced by Indian poetry. People like Rabindranath Tagore. Rabindranath Tagore, in fact, has wielded a lot of influence on Sri Lankan literature. Some of it is conscious, some of it is unconscious. So, we can now speak in a nutshell about Sri Lankan poetry by going to The next slide, Sri Lankan poetry. If you look at it, there are names. I'm not going to talk too much about names because it is not my intention to give you a survey of Sri Lankan literature poetry in English. I have to tell you something about it, starting with people like the senior. I have to talk about him because he had a pioneering role to play. Then there was George Keats, a painter and poet who produced 3 volumes of poetry. Then Allah, the Lake District poets of England, there were also the Candy Lake poets, chief amongst whom was obviously Sunita Wickramasinghe. There have been others. People like Patrick Fernando, people like Jean. Just one second. Hello. Classmate. Arasanayagam. People like Yasmin Gunaratne. People like Lagdasa Wickramasinghe. Because there have been many traditions, many ways of looking at things. Sri Lankan poets in English, to a great extent, have been people from the upper class, urban writers. In many cases, they have been educated in English, from English medium backgrounds, Western education. So obviously, they have been anglicized in some cases. They have used the English idiom and the English medium. In some cases, wholesale. In the case of someone like Yasmin Gunaratne, for example, she accepts the English literary and poetic tradition, but with a detachment of ironic insight. She can embrace the English language like a lover. In this language, this woman. But she is not unaware of the discrepancies, the shortcomings. There have been those like Arasanayagam who have tried to weld together a kind of a mixed medium by bringing in Tamil words and phrases. But in many cases, that welding has not been very happy. Similarly, there have been others like Lagdasa Wickramasinghe who have tried to forge a medium thanks to the adept phase, ADEPT, adept phase. They have tried to bring in the best of both, the West and the East. So, in today's discussion, I have tried to chart a path, to blaze a trail for you, my dear students, my dear friends. You will have to do the reading. You will have to do the exploration. But I can only tempt you by telling you that very rich mine full of gems and precious metals lie ahead. So, with this, we come to the end of this session. so far as my lecture, my croaking is concerned. Thanks for watching, but one thing is there. Now I throw this session open for discussion. Any queries, any comments, any doubts?